On the morning of the 3rd of July 2022, a man named Lee Barraclough had just returned home from a morning bike ride, not realising that a discovery he was about to make would change his life forever. As Lee was preparing to enter his home, he happened to notice that his neighbour's front door was wide open. Confused and intrigued by such an unusual thing to see, Lee decided to make his way over to the door and investigate the situation. He walked up to the door, and as he was trying to figure out the reason as to why the door had been left ajar, he discovered a scene so horrifying it was burnt into his memory forever. As he peered through into the house, he found his next door neighbour lying in a pool of his own blood, having been tortured to death. This is the story of Thomas Campbell, a Manchester drug dealer whose ex-wife and rival dealers' jealousy and hate led to his torture and death. Hello ladies, hello gentlemen, and welcome to the Diary of Madmen and Monsters, where we speak to and about the madmen, women and monsters who inhabit our society. Thank you all for watching and listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Before I begin, if you enjoy stories and discussions about true crime, criminals, serial killers and the lives of underworld figures, then you found the channel for you. So please give us a follow and a like and help us to grow the channel to bring more of these videos your way. On the night of the 2nd of July, a rival dealer along with a crew of bloodthirsty underlings set into action a plan that had been in the making for over a week. The plan was to torture and rob Thomas Campbell, a Manchester criminal who had, by all accounts, a large amount of buried treasure stashed away somewhere safe away from prying eyes. The plan, however, took a dark turn at some point, and Thomas was subjected to a sickening amount of punishment that has been described as horrific by those involved in the case. This torture led to the untimely death of a father of two and the incarceration of his ex-wife and the mother of his kids. So let's start at the beginning and watch as this truly gruesome tale unfolds. Thomas Campbell was born in Manchester, England in 1983 and had been involved in the criminal underworld for more than 2 decades. His criminal past had a colourful array of example of offences, from charges for illegal substance supply to assault and money laundering. The most prolific case that Thomas had been involved in, however, was a case in 2002, when at just 19 years old, he was sentenced to 9 years in prison for his part in a terrifying robbery conspiracy, involving the use of weapons, including a samurai sword. It was fair to say that Thomas was an experienced member of the criminal underworld and had, by all accounts, profited quite prolifically from his criminal dealings. After his release from prison in 2008, having served just 6 years of the 9-year sentence, Thomas met his future wife, Colleen. Colleen lived in Clayton, East Manchester, in a single mother household after her father became absent from her life at the age of 5 years old due to being put in prison on illegal substance-related charges. Although Colleen knew of Thomas's criminal dealings, this didn't seem to faze her. In fact, in what some would consider a whirlwind romance, they quite quickly had a child together in 2010, less than 2 years after meeting, and then went on to marry in 2011, with another child arriving in 2015. Despite Thomas's family life, he wasn't deterred from following his criminal path, and in 2010 was convicted for possession with intent to supply Class B drugs, and police intelligence allege he was also involved in the supply of illegal substances through 2010 up until 2021. Colleen and Thomas enjoyed the fruits of Thomas's criminal escapades together, enjoying an extravagant jet-set lifestyle filled with expensive cars, homes, home improvements and holidays, which they shared extensively on their social media profiles. They seemed to enjoy sharing the high life they lived, some of which included a £10,000 holiday to Cancun, a double-storey extension on their home, and fortunes spent on designer clothes and jewellery. Unfortunately for the pair, the prolific sharing of such extravagant spending raised suspicions about their income. After all, how could Thomas, who pretended to be a fitness instructor online, and Colleen, who worked in a clothing shop and claimed working tax credits, afford to live such a luxurious lifestyle? In 2014, the Greater Manchester Police decided to launch Operation Harness to investigate the links between the Campbells' involvement with illegal substance supply in the Clayton area of Manchester. The police were intrigued to find that Thomas, who had been unemployed since 2008, and Colleen, who worked part-time in a clothing store and claimed benefits, were driving around in brand new cars, including Audis, Mercedes and BMW X5s, and were indeed living the life of luxury that they had been sharing online. In March 2015, the police decided to raid their house, and the cars were immediately seized via the Proceeds of Crime Act. The investigation found that not only did the finances they had been enjoying come from illicit means, but that Thomas was indeed involved in a vast network of illegal substance suppliers. On Friday the 16th of August 2019, Thomas was sentenced to 2 years in prison after pleading guilty to money laundering. And Colleen was sentenced to 16 months in prison, suspended for 2 years after pleading guilty to the very same. It was found that the couple had spent in excess of £100,000 across a 5-year period on luxury holidays, high-powered cars and expensive clothing and jewellery, despite their only legitimate income source being benefits Colleen was claiming and the part-time job she was holding down. It was during the prison sentence in 2019 that things between Thomas and Colleen began to unravel. Colleen maintained that she was faithful to Thomas whilst he waited out his sentence. But he became incredibly suspicious and jealous during his stay at Her Majesty's pleasure. He suspected that she was being unfaithful, and upon his eventual release, he confronted her with the accusations. This, amongst other issues, is rumoured to be the driving force behind the breakdown of their marriage. Thomas then decided to leave the marital home and moved into an apartment in the city. Unfortunately, this created resentment between them, leading to a period of heightened drama between the two. Frequent spats and back and forth tit-for-tat situations, eventually leading to both reporting the other to the police. Colleen reported that he threatened her repeatedly, attacking her and put tracking devices on her car, whilst Thomas reported that she had thrown things at him, damaged his property, and was repeatedly verbally abusive towards him. It was a highly volatile time for the pair. But despite this, neither of them decided to press charges on the other. Eventually, Colleen accused Thomas of having an affair with her former best friend, and during this period, Colleen was charged with criminal damage after smashing up her former best friend's car. In 2021, they finally filed for divorce, with Colleen's final words to Thomas regarding the marriage being, "Karma is best served cold, and I can be the coldest MF you ever meet." These words would turn out to be a stark warning of the heinous events to come. Once separated, Thomas continued his criminal dealings in the underworld and found what he thought was a sound way of communicating with the rest of the criminal fraternity using the coveted EncroChat that was a trusted source of communication between criminals of the UK. This changed, however, in March 2020, when the French authorities managed to hack the system and gained access to millions of conversations and images between criminal associates. Upon hearing that the chat was compromised, many criminals believed they would be targeted in police operations, and many of them fled the country, including Thomas, who decided to lay low abroad, settling in Marbella and Dubai. After a period away from the UK, Thomas decided that due to wanting to have a closer relationship with his kids, he wanted to return home to Manchester. And upon doing so, bought a £350,000 house in an uptown area of Greater Manchester called Mosley, where he moved in with his new girlfriend. This would prove to be his ultimate undoing, as it was this single domino that sparked into life the plan that would lead to his demise. Upon Thomas's return to the UK, Thomas and Colleen had agreed to put their drama aside and try and co-parent their kids as best they could. And despite their past, they seemed to be getting on well, putting on a united front at social gatherings and the like. But Colleen still seethed under the surface. She still maintained a want for revenge on her ex-husband and would have the chance to visit that revenge upon him very soon. As I previously mentioned, Thomas had become involved in a relationship with another woman. A woman who, simply by virtue of having had a previous relationship with a rival dealer in the area, would unwittingly spark off a series of events that would lead to Thomas's cold-blooded murder. Whether Thomas knew about said previous relationship or not, we are not aware, but nonetheless, when the ex-boyfriend of his new partner found out about the relationship she was having with Thomas, he certainly wasn't happy. The ex-boyfriend's name was John Belfield, and he was a rival illegal substances supplier in the Manchester area. Although I couldn't find any mention that they had had any previous altercations, it was plain to see that John did not take kindly to Thomas dating his ex via a text he sent to his ex-partner regarding her new relationship. "You and that helmet will get domed. You'll never have a boyfriend. You will have to move country. Give it a week and you will see why and what happens when you take the piss. Why would I ever respect you when you are seeing Tom Campbell?" It's plain to see by this message that the very thought of his ex shacking up with Tom was an insult to John. He was infuriated by the thought of his ex finding someone else, and especially that the person she had found was a rival of his. And the result was that he vowed to punish them both with violence. This should have been a massive warning sign for Thomas. John was out to get revenge and had begun to formulate a plan so violent that it was described as horrific by those involved in the case. So here we have two people involved in Thomas's life who had a bitter and twisted need for revenge against him. One was John Belfield, a rival dealer who seemingly felt affronted by the fact his ex-girlfriend had chosen Thomas over him. And the other was his ex-wife Colleen, who was still maddened by Thomas's choice to pursue a new relationship over the old relationship he had had with her. Both were, it seemed, being for blood. But at this point, they had never met and given their individual hatred for Thomas a chance to combine and grow. This, however, was about to change. On Saturday 25th of June 2022, John Belfield logged into his Facebook profile and began searching for a specific name. He found the name he was looking for, clicked on the profile and hit the Add Friend button. On Sunday 26th of June, Colleen was browsing Facebook when she happened to notice a friend request had came in. It was John Belfield. He had found out that Colleen was Thomas's ex-wife and decided to try his luck to glean any information that he could from her. Upon seeing his request, Colleen clicked on the profile, had a look through the pictures and liked one of his photos. This, what on the surface could seem like an innocent interaction between Facebook friends, would be the start of a plan John Belfield had devised to get the ultimate revenge on Thomas. And it just so happened that he had chosen the ideal person to help him achieve it. Colleen knew all of the details one would need to smooth out the rough edges surrounding the plot to get the revenge that John wanted. She knew Thomas's whereabouts, details about the amount of money and goods Thomas owned, where he preferred to hide his stash, and his daily comings and goings. And more to the point, she too was as highly motivated to seek revenge as he was. And so began an extensive communicative back and forth. All in all, it was documented that John and Colleen exchanged 35 phone calls and 68 messages between them in the run-up to Thomas's death. You can only imagine that each call and text message was fueled with a want for revenge so strong that it created a tight bond between the pair. The plan was, at first at least, to rob Thomas and take what was called by some of the individuals on trial his buried treasure. This came from the fact that Colleen had mentioned in her communication that Thomas would often bury his cash, expensive items and illegal substances in his garden and in different locations over the years. What actually unfolded, however, was on another scale completely compared to simply robbing a man of his possession. Whether Colleen truly knew that this was the fate in store for Thomas is something she vehemently denies. But on the 27th of June, Colleen informed John Belfield that Thomas was on his way to pick their daughter up from school. This would be the first step of the plan that John Belfield had devised. In order to enact said plan, John had recruited the help of two accomplices, Rhys Stephen and Stephen Cleworth. Their task was to place a tracking device on Thomas's car so they could monitor his movements across coming days and figure out when and where it would be best to put their plan into action. John instructed his accomplices to place the tracker on Thomas's car without causing a scene, and he himself stayed back in his car to avoid detection. In their exchanges, Colleen had described Thomas's vehicle perfectly, enabling the pair to find his vehicle easily and attach the device. From here, they were able to track Thomas's movements completely, and using the device, followed his movements back to his home in Mossley, confirming where he lived. To confirm the exact house, John texted Colleen asking for Thomas's house number, which she was only too happy to give. Colleen confirmed that the door number was number 17, and this now meant John had the details that he needed to put the next part of his plan into operation. Just to be sure they had the correct location, John and Rhys, one of his accomplices, decided to perform a recce and go out and scope out Thomas's house. Upon arrival, John pointed out the exact house that was Thomas's, and they had it fully confirmed between them, the location that they would ambush Thomas at. Now, it was just a case of deciding when. Up to now, John and Colleen still hadn't met in person and had been devising their plans regarding Thomas in calls and texts. But just days before the brutal murder, they decided to meet in Colleen's car around the corner from her salon. Here, they discussed their plans, and John even showed Colleen the app that fed the information from the tracking device on Tom's car back to him so he could track it. The exact details of the conversation were never released, but what we do know is that John shared at least part of his plan with Colleen and received her approval. Once the meeting was over, John, accompanied by Rhys, decided to return to Thomas's home to scope out more of the situation and to finally agree on a date and time. At 11:26 p.m, John and Rhys watched as Thomas returned home and entered his home, sealing their plans in place and cementing their commitment to their cause. John further confirmed his murderous plot via the action of sending Colleen a text message that contained just one single word: tomorrow. And so, the location, time and date was now set. John, accompanied by Rhys and Stephen, would return the night after, on the 30th of June, and commit the dastardly deed. However, like all well-laid plans, this one was filled with hurdles and unforeseen setbacks. On the night of the 30th, John, Rhys and Stephen lay in wait in the shadows near Thomas's house for his return home. They waited as his car pulled up and confirmed that the plan was to attack Thomas on his doorstep, bundle him inside and then force him to reveal where his buried treasure was located. However, their devious plot would not go ahead that night, as when Thomas returned, he decided to take his dog out for a walk, spoiling their plans completely. At that point, they decided between them to abort their mission for now and regroup for another day later in the week. The decision was then made to reconvene on the 2nd of July, where they would put into action in full their carefully orchestrated plan. As I previously mentioned, however, more hurdles and setbacks arose when, on the day in question, Stephen Cleworth went on the missing list, instead choosing to go on a bender rather than attend the planned event. John communicated his frustrations to Stephen in a message where he described how he was disappointed by the letdown. John, however, wasn't going to allow another setback to derail his plans again. Instead, he sought the help of a family member by the name of Carl Murphy, who John simply asked for a lift for him and some of his friends. It has been noted throughout the trial that Carl was fully unaware of the reason behind why John and his associates needed a lift. It is on record that Carl was simply an innocent member of the party who had been tricked into becoming an accessory in the plan by the devious John Belfield. So, in Stephen's stead, Carl agreed to take John, Reese and another of John's associates who has remained unnamed to their destination. On the night of the 2nd, they decided to park in the driveway of a neighbour's vacant house close to Thomas's, and just 5 minutes after their arrival, Thomas arrived home. The plan was now ready to enter its final stage, and the three men, ready to exact the revenge John and Colleen were looking for, sprang from their hiding place and rushed Thomas as he stood opening his front door. CCTV footage shows the three men impart what can only be described as extreme violence as they repeatedly strike Thomas with weapons and fists to overcome him at his front door. After 40 seconds of relentless beating and stabbing, Thomas could fight no more, and the three assailants managed to force him off of his doorstep and into his property. And unfortunately for Thomas, this is where the full force of their fury would be enacted. For 2 hours, they beat, stabbed and tortured Thomas, using extreme levels of violence to inflict harm and punishment upon him. Throughout their trial, Rhys Stevens and Stephen Cleworth maintained that the whole reason for doing what they did to Thomas was to find out whereabouts his buried treasure was located. But with such levels of violence and the lengths at which they went to humiliate Thomas, it's plain to see that there was a strong motive of revenge and humiliation behind the attack. For hours, they punched, kicked, stabbed and carved chunks out of Thomas, repeatedly scalding him with boiling water across his torso after stripping him naked and securing his feet together at the ankles. It was described by those who attended the scene after as a bloodbath, and was more akin to a punishment beating than a mere torture in search of information. Although there was no indication of who had inflicted what damage upon Thomas specifically, it is said that they ransacked his home completely as they tortured Thomas, looking for clues as to where he had hidden his money and jewellery, covering his home in blood as they went. After 2 hours of relentless punishment, they cleaned up after themselves and finally left Thomas's house, leaving Thomas in a pool of his own blood and boiling water, and leaving the door open as they made their getaway. The gang left Thomas with a total of 61 separate injuries, multiple of which were enough to cause his death, but combined made his death a certainty. They left him in excruciating pain, on death's door, and only moments away from succumbing to his injuries. But before he did, in what must have seemed like a gargantuan effort, Thomas gathered up what little strength he had left and managed to get to his phone, dialing 999 and getting through to the operator. But in what must have been a heartbreaking scenario for his friends and family to learn, he simply couldn't muster the strength to say a word. No matter what the operator on the other end of the phone did and how many times they asked, they couldn't get Thomas to speak. Over the next few hours, lying on the floor in his home alone, Thomas succumbed to his injuries. Around 10 hours later, after getting back from a bike ride, Thomas's next door neighbour Lee arrived back to his home, and upon his arrival, he noticed that the door to his neighbour Tom's home had been left open. He looked around to see if he could see Tom, but as he couldn't, and it was quite an unusual sight to see, he decided to go over to Tom's house and investigate, just to make sure that everything was okay. So he left his own garden, made his way up Tom's garden path and peered inside the open door. And what he found there will be imprinted on his mind forever. There was Thomas lying in the same position he had passed in from the night before after succumbing to his injuries. It was plain to see that Thomas had passed and that something sinister had taken place. And so Lee phoned the police immediately, who arrived in minutes to take control of the scene. Despite the sheer amount of activity that must have taken place across the 2-hour period that the assailants were in Thomas's home, there was a complete lack of DNA evidence at the scene of the crime. This, the police believe, is due to how forensically aware the gang was. They managed to perform a thorough cleanup of their actions, leaving no trace of them as individuals at the scene. This proved incredibly difficult for the police at first, because they had even removed the CCTV footage as well as the video doorbell at the front door. Despite this, the police got to work in trying to piece together the events of Thomas's death, and slowly a picture of what happened began to emerge. Now, the police also had the unenviable task of letting the family members of Thomas know about his passing. This would of course prove to be an emotional situation and was not taken lightly by them one bit. The police decided that the first person they should contact was, of course, the mother of his children in his ex-wife Colleen. Upon hearing the news, Colleen put on a show of being visibly upset in front of the police, putting on the waterworks and truly making it seem as though she was devastated by the passing of her children's father. However, it was noted in the trial that Colleen, shockingly, returned back to work the very next day after hearing about her children's father's death. You would think that someone who had just had to tell their kids their father had died might have at least taken a couple of days to support her children at the dreadful news they had just received. I mean, no matter what your personal feelings about him. This might tell us a lot about just how cold and callous Colleen could truly be. After the attack on Thomas, John Belfield and Rhys Stevens went into hiding, with the former of the two fleeing the UK and taking up refuge in Suriname, South America. As the police continued to conduct their investigation, they made a key discovery that led them to uncover the full details of the devious plot. After one of the police involved in the crime had a suspicion that it was possible a tracker may have been used to track Thomas's movements, and consequent CCTV footage showing this to be the case, the police decided to see if they could locate a GPS signal that came from a tracker being used in the area at the time of the crime. And it was this discovery of said tracker signal that led to the case being blown wide open. The police now knew that a tracker had been used in the crime and that they could use this tracker to track the movements of the criminals prior to and after the crime. Alongside this, they also found CCTV footage of the attack on Thomas's doorstep, and so were able to begin truly putting a picture of what happened on the night of the 2nd of July together. Using this newfound revelation, the police were then able to track the van's movements immediately after the murder, which led them to a location called Peak Forest. Here, due to an extensive search, including a diving team searching the canal, a large amount of evidence was found, including the phone containing the app used to track Thomas's car, which had been bent in half and thrown in the canal. Luckily, the police were able to recover the information from the phone, showing the exact movements of the killers before and after their ambush on Thomas. They also found remnants of Thomas Campbell's driving licence and a partially burnt flask in a small fire that the gang had had in an effort to get rid of evidence of the crime. The flask, it was confirmed, was the vessel used to transport boiling water to the scene of the torture. With the investigation coming together, it was at this point in time that John Belfield's name as a suspect began to arise, with police managing to get a lead on his mobile phone as it had been passed on to someone else after the event. With this find, they were able to uncover all of the text messages and phone calls between Colleen and John, discussing details regarding Thomas's address and registration. It was also found that John had made a 25-minute long phone call approximately 2 hours before Thomas was ambushed to none other than Colleen Campbell. It was at this point that the police began to figure out that Colleen had also played a major part in this plot to unalive her ex-husband. Using the tracker, the phone recovered from the canal, and John Belfield's phone, the police could now create a timeline of events across the hours and days before the event that built up a detailed story of who was involved and how. The only thing left to do now was to bring in Colleen Campbell, Rhys Stevens and Stephen Cleworth for questioning. The search for John Belfield continued, with police believing that he had skipped the country and was hiding somewhere in Spain. Of course, Colleen denied any involvement and protested with shouts of, "Why would I want him dead? I still love him." But the police saw through her pleas, and on the 13th of July, she was arrested on suspicion of Thomas's murder. Visibly shocked and upset, she again pleaded, "This has nothing to do with me." Subsequently, Rhys Stevens was arrested on behalf of his extensive involvement in the planning and execution of the crime. And Stephen Cleworth was also arrested in connection with the murder due to his part in the planning of the crime. All three of the suspects pleaded not guilty to the crimes they were arrested for, and after a 5-week-long trial, a jury of their peers found them all guilty of conspiracy to rob, with Colleen and Stephen Cleworth being found guilty of manslaughter, reflecting their lesser but still vital involvement in the death of Thomas. Rhys Stevens, who was found to have played a much more extensive part than Colleen and Stephen Cleworth, was found guilty of murder. On Wednesday, the 2nd of February 2023, at Bolton Crown Court, Rhys Stevens, 29, of Middleton, Manchester, was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 37 years for murder and conspiracy to rob. Colleen Campbell, 38, of Bamford Street, Manchester, was sentenced to 13 years in jail after being found guilty of manslaughter and conspiracy to rob. She must serve 3/4 of her sentence before being considered for parole. And Stephen Cleworth, 38, of Haywood, Manchester, was sentenced to a minimum term of 12 years for manslaughter and conspiracy to rob. All three of the gang tried to minimise their involvement in this vehement act of violence and murder. But thankfully, the court saw through their pleas. As for John Belfield, after making his escape to South America, he set up residence in the country of Suriname. And after getting himself arrested in said country on drugs charges, the 29-year-old was recognised as a fugitive from the law in the UK, and that he was wanted in connection with the murder of Thomas Campbell. He was then subsequently deported back to the UK, arriving on the 9th of March 2024 to face charges of murder, conspiracy to murder, manslaughter, conspiracy to rob, and conspiracy to supply Class A drugs. After pleading not guilty to Thomas Campbell's murder, a trial date has been set for June 3rd, 2025. As a finishing note on this case, I have to say that my condolences go out to the families and children of all involved. No matter how you feel about those involved, no one deserves to die in such harrowing circumstances. And I truly feel for not just those subject to such harsh treatment, but the families of those involved. May Thomas rest in peace, and I hope that those around him can find peace in their own lives too. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.